In this video, I will be attempting to make an open world Pokemon game where you can battle wild Pokemon in the open world itself, catch them, fight trainers along the way, and if you survive long enough, even this big ass dragon at the end. And to share my experience with all of you, I've boiled down my entire journey into this 5-pillar video.
So, it's just a cheap copy of my game, right?
Go away, Arceus, no one even likes you. I mean, you call yourself God, but you aren't even the strongest Pokemon. Anyway, recently I stumbled on this video from
I spent the last year remastering classic games into new 3D styles.
This person recreated Pokemon Red and Blue, but in 3D. I thought it might be fun to revisit this idea as an open world game like the newer Legends Arceus, rather than stick to the classic RPG format. Luckily, I have some experience with Unity to try and take on this challenge. Not so lucky, however, are my 3D modeling and animation skills. So instead of trying to learn Blender or import models from the original games, which is a very convoluted process, I decided to only use free assets which I could find on the asset store. But before we begin, we need a world and a Pokemon trainer. So I imported this terrain for the environment and this totally appropriate character into Unity. Oh, it already has the walk, run and jump animations. This game's about to be a walk in the park. Oh, there's no throwing animation for the Pokeballs. Unfortunately, I hate Blender and don't want to download any animations from Mixamo, so let's just blend between two different animations to get the desired result. Another successful operation from Dr. Powdy. Here's what it looks like in the game. I haven't added the Pokeballs yet, but I'm sure it will look much better when I do. Next, I'll start moving the player. I borrowed this code from an old tutorial of mine on character controllers. It's not terribly interesting. The main part is just this function for rotating the player towards some specified direction. Then there's this bit which updates the position of the player in that direction. And we can control the speed of that. Finally, there's this function which lets the player jump by updating the rigid body velocity, which just means adding some speed in the y direction for an instant, letting our humble Pokemon trainer leap into the skies, at least in theory. But it seems that physics is finally broken, or I've made some typo. Here it is. Alright, much better. But we still need some Pokemon in our game, so the next thing I did was download and import these very beautiful models for Pokemon and started creating stats for each one inside scriptable objects. And I was interested to learn that in the actual games a lot of this data is actually hidden from the player, and the basic idea is to calculate the value of each stat using this complicated formula. So now we just need to be able to calculate any stat on our Pokemon at a specific level, and being able to calculate the stats gained per level is almost certainly going to be useful at some point. So I've been fiddling around with maths and swapping numbers around until I ended up with this function. And just to test that it's definitely working properly, I used it to compare the stats of a Bagon with its equivalent in my game with 0 IVs, EVs and a neutral nature at different levels, since my game doesn't include any of those values. I find it fascinating looking at all these different Pokemon sprites, just how much personality it showed off for each Pokemon. Like this energetic Politoed, it just gives off happy vibes. As someone with a very rocky foundation in art and animation, I've been very disappointed with the 3D models in the recent games. I mean, just look at the same Pokemon in 3D. It's got me very excited about the prospect of doing a remake of an older Pokemon game in the modern HD 2D style sometime. I think that would be a lot of fun. It's also interesting to me how these 2D sprites would look on a 3D terrain. I'm kind of curious if they'll be able to wander around the 3D world and chase the player. And I guess we can find that out. I'll go into the Pokemon state system quickly, and currently it's just playing the idle animation. There's also some boilerplate which I've left out for some clarity, but let's add some wander and chase behavior to the Pokemon. So I want the Pokemon to walk around the terrain randomly every so often, but if the player gets close to it or comes in its field of view, then I want it to start chasing the player until we get away from it. Conveniently, Unity has the AI navigation package for just this. Going back to the code, I'll create a random direction from the starting position of the Pokemon, and if it reaches a distance of its wander radius, we'll calculate a new destination. So now let's pick a radius. I think 5 makes sense. Then I'll just start increasing the speed, and we can see that the Pokemon goofily walking around its starting position randomly. For chasing the player, I created a player detector script which checks the angle towards the player at all times, and if this angle is within a certain range, then the Pokemon starts moving towards the player. Here's what it would look like if the speed was at 100 and the angle was set to a full 360 degrees. Yeah, just your average hentai episode. Well, you're probably thinking, great politics simulator dumbass, but where are the Pokemon battles? I clicked on a Pokemon game in the thumbnail, I wanna see Pokemon battles. Well, relax. I eventually decided to create a battle system which at the moment just plays a small cutscene at the beginning and switches the camera to get a better view of both the Pokemon whenever a collision happens with the player. When you're working with collisions though, it's important to test what happens at high speeds because that's when things tend to get a little bizarre. And sure enough, we can see the camera starting to get a mind of its own, so that's gonna need some work. After some fiddling around, I have this bit of code for the player and this for the wild Pokemons. I've also been spending some time with the UI, struggling to make it look good, but let's take it for a quick spin around a battle. Anyway, I hope you don't mind indulging my newfound enthusiasm for Pokemon maths again, because I've just been learning about how different moves work and how the damage is calculated, which led me to this unnecessarily long formula. So let's simplify it a little, and by that I mean just getting rid of all the dumb and useless mechanics introduced in the later generations. Yeah, Pokemon is very cool. Significantly less cool, however, is the number of moves I would have to make if I recreated every single one of them. So I decided to give each Pokemon one move per type. So this Magmudge got Tackle and Ember, this Turbotuga got Accel Rock and Bubble, and so on. And my sanity is already sounding a lot happier. Another obvious feature is stat boosting moves. For example, here's a move called Shell Smash. It doesn't deal any damage but doubles the attack, special attack and speed of the user while lowering the defense and special defense. And some moves apply these changes to opposing Pokemon instead. So I created a list of stats the move would affect and the target of these changes. Since each stat can be raised or lowered 6 times in Pokemon and depending on the stage a different multiplier is applied, I hard-coded these values and tweaked my damage function a tiny bit to use the modified values instead of the actual stats. After running this code, the regular moves inflict damage to the enemy while the status moves apply the modifications to stats. To actually make use of that though, I've created a battle controller which stores all the references to the UI and updates it whenever a property like the Pokemon's HP or the move's PP changes, and also displays the moves for each Pokemon. The next thing I did was give my player the ability to switch Pokemon and run away from battles, because let's face it, she's a woman. Here I decided to not refresh the wild Pokemon if you run away from a battle. So if you lower its HP, run away, and decide you want to fight it again, it will still have the same HP, which I thought was quite interesting as this gives the game a more realistic feel. What I'd like to figure out next is some way of interacting with different trainers or something like gym leaders and starting a battle with them. So I went back and imported yet another appropriate model into Unity which will act as a trainer you can battle, and I wrote a little script to display some dialogue and start the battle, which was a very straightforward task. But nonetheless, I still managed to fumble by not making sure you're not allowed to run away from trainer battles. But here at last we have trainer battles. I made them incredibly hard so you'd have the incentive to train and catch Pokemon before thinking of even battling the trainer. Okay, so my original idea was just till this point, but it's not really a Pokemon game if you can't catch new Pokemon, and I have a slightly convoluted plan for doing that which I hope is going to work. The first step which I've been working on here is to implement the Pokemon's weird catching algorithm. I mean, these numbers just look like the programmers had a stroke while coming up with them. I know I certainly did. Back in our battle controller, we can now check if a Pokemon is caught using this function, and to visualize that, we can just shake the Pokeball depending on the number of checks. So I went ahead and created another cutscene for catching Pokemon and wrote this function to shake the ball. And that's the game pretty much done except for the legendary dragon which I promised at the beginning, which is going to be pretty easy. And I'm getting pretty burned out since I have the attention span of a goldfish, so let's add that real quick. I'll add this model into the world and make it an NPC so the player can interact with it and start a battle. And we can add a small dialogue at the beginning, just like our favorite Lord and Savior Arceus says,